Deborah Atrops had been trying to build a new life. In late 1988, she was a young mother living in Salem, Oregon, separated from her husband, Bob Atrops. Their baby daughter, Rihanna, was still an infant, and custody exchanges were part of the routine. Debbie was also quietly starting over in other ways, including a new relationship that she did not want Bob to discover. On Tuesday, November 29th, 1988, Debbie followed a normal schedule. She had a hair appointment that evening. Afterward, she was expected to pick up Rihanna. The plan was simple and familiar. She would arrive, take her daughter, and head home. She never showed up. That night, Bob reported Debbie missing. He said she was late, far later than she should have been after the appointment. The missing person report started a search, but the window between Debbie's last confirmed movements and the call to report her missing was already tight. It was not the kind of disappearance where days pass in uncertainty. Less than 2 days later, Debbie's car was found abandoned near a construction site. When the trunk was opened, Debbie's body was inside. She was face down. She had been strangled. There were no signs of sexual assault. The scene did not suggest a random predator. It suggested something closer, something personal, something controlled. And from the start, the people closest to Debbie were pulled into the center of the story. Bob Atrops was the estranged husband, the father of her baby, the person tied to her by law and history even after separation. John Pearson was the new boyfriend, a man Debbie worked with, someone she was seeing regularly in the weeks leading up to her death, someone she had reason to keep private. In 1988, the case moved through early leads and early suspicion, but it did not land on a single provable answer. There was no confession, no clean trail of physical evidence that could be locked down with the tools of the time. So Debbie Atrops became another name in a file, another case that sat year after year, waiting for the moment when something would finally shift. But the people left behind did not freeze in place the way the case file did. Rihanna grew up without her mother. She was only 8 months old when Debbie died. Her life was shaped by absence, by unanswered questions, by a story she could never remember firsthand. Bob raised her. As Rihanna got older, her understanding of her father formed in the ordinary way a child's does through daily life. He was there. He guided her. He built a family life around her after Debbie was gone. In time, Rihanna became an adult and later a mother herself. Bob became a grandfather, deeply involved with her children. The murder remained unsolved for decades. Then, more than 30 years after Debbie was found in the trunk, the case was reopened with new energy. The old evidence was still there. Items collected in 1988, preserved because someone had the sense that time might eventually change what could be pulled from them. Debbie's coat, kept from the original investigation, was examined again. This time, the focus was on tiny traces of DNA. Not the kind that would have stood out in 1988, but the kind that modern testing could sometimes detect and interpret. The results did not create an instant answer. They did not draw a bright red line from Debbie's body to one person's hands. But they did narrow the field. John Pearson, the boyfriend, could be excluded by the DNA testing. Another man from Debbie's past, Jeff Rayberg, could also be excluded. Bob Atrops could not be definitively excluded. The amount of DNA involved was extremely small, the kind that could be measured in only a few skin cells. That smallness mattered because it left room for arguments about accidental transfer, contamination, and the reality that Debbie and Bob shared a child and shared contact through custody. Still, the fact remained. The testing did not remove Bob from the picture. At the same time, attention returned to another early thread from 1988, one that had never sat right: the phone calls. Back then, Bob said that after Debbie failed to arrive, he called multiple people. He said he called the babysitter. He said he called Debbie's boss. He said he called Debbie's parents. People confirmed receiving calls. Debbie's parents confirmed it. Her stepfather confirmed it. Her stepfather confirmed it. The babysitter confirmed it, yet the home phone records did not show those long-distance calls. In that era, even calls made from one town to another could be billed as long distance. Bob lived about 30 miles from Debbie's parents. If he had called them from his house, those calls should have left a footprint. But they did not. If the calls happened, and they did, where did Bob make them from? Years later, when the reopened case focused back on that gap, Bob gave a new explanation. He said he used an Misi calling card. It was a detail that would not have mattered much if it had been there from the beginning, but it wasn't. It arrived decades later, after the case had been re-examined, after suspicion had resurfaced, after investigators had returned with sharper questions. A calling card would change how calls appeared on a bill. It could explain why long-distance charges were not visible in the expected way. But the explanation also raised another issue. Using that kind of calling card required entering a long code, the kind of code that would be difficult to imagine someone entering in the middle of panic and urgency. It introduced the image of a person who had time, who was thinking about records and traceability, who was managing the story of the night while the night was still unfolding. The reopened investigation also returned to the physical condition of Debbie's car and the soil on it. Back in 1988, the car was not just evidence of where Debbie ended up. It was evidence of where she had been before she ended up there. Mud was part of that. There was mud on the car, and it looked like some of it had been wiped away. There was mud on Debbie's shoes. Investigators had collected samples from Bob's driveway and lawn. They had photographed the gravel and mud outside his house. They had tried to compare tire tracks, but the driveway had been visited by many people once Debbie was reported missing. Friends and family came and went, worried and searching, leaving behind their own marks. So tire tracks alone could not prove whether Debbie's car had been there. But the soil itself became a renewed point of focus decades later. The mud found on the car tire was analyzed and compared to soil from Bob's lawn. The texture, color, and composition were considered indistinguishable. The area where they lived, the Willamette Valley, contained soil that could be common across wide stretches. That made soil evidence difficult because it could suggest a match without proving a unique origin. Yet within the overall case, it added weight to the idea that Debbie's car had been at or near Bob's property before it was abandoned and before Debbie was found in the trunk. As the case moved forward, the narrative of Debbie's relationship with Bob also came back into the open. The separation had not been peaceful. Debbie had been afraid of Bob. She had told friends about his temper. She had told at least one friend that he had choked her not long before she moved out. She had spoken about fear during custody exchanges, the moments where she and Bob would be face to face, with emotions close to the surface and no buffer between them. Those moments mattered because Debbie disappeared on a day when she was expected to go to Bob's house for their daughter. And there was another spark sitting in the background. Debbie's new relationship. She was dating John Pearson, a man she worked with. She had reason to keep it quiet. She was afraid Bob would find out. Bob knew her boss. The overlap between her work life and her personal life was not sealed off from him. If Bob learned about the new relationship, it could have changed the temperature of that night. And in cases like this, temperature is often what decides whether a confrontation stays verbal or becomes something else. John Pearson's role was examined early because he was close to Debbie in the days and weeks before she died. When questioned, he admitted he had been with Debbie. He described her car in unusual detail, including what was in the trunk. He mentioned a Burger King bag, a box with cranberries, and a child's car seat. He even commented on the trunk itself, wondering how a body could fit inside it. The detail was striking, but the context mattered too. John and Debbie were seeing each other frequently. They worked together. They ate lunch together. They were often in the car. Familiarity could explain knowledge of the contents. John cooperated during the original investigation. He agreed to multiple interviews. He took a polygraph and passed it. Nothing in the evidence ultimately held him in the center. The case drifted back toward the person it had circled from the beginning, Bob Atrops. In March of 2023, Bob was arrested for Debbie's murder. By then, the story was no longer just the story of what happened to Debbie in 1988. It was also the story of what happens when a case comes back to life decades later, when a family has spent years building a reality around uncertainty, and then that reality is torn open again. Rihanna was blindsided by the arrest. In her mind, the man taken into custody was the man who raised her, the man she trusted, the man she believed was innocent. She felt the loss of her mother as something permanent, something that never healed because it had never been understood. Now she faced the possibility of losing her father, too. The trial forced the past into the present. The prosecution built the case around the pattern that had been described from Debbie's life: the controlling behavior, the temper, the choking, the fear, the custody exchanges. The likelihood of confrontation. The possibility that Bob had discovered Debbie was moving on and could not tolerate it. The theory was clear. A confrontation happened during the expected pickup. The confrontation escalated. Bob strangled Debbie. Her body was placed into the trunk of her own car. The car was moved. The calls were made from somewhere other than the home phone, possibly while the car and body were being dealt with. The defense pushed back against the reliability of the stories about abuse, against the strength of the DNA evidence, against the idea that soil could pinpoint a lawn in a region where similar soil was widespread. Bob had supporters in the courtroom, not only Rihanna. By that point in his life, he had been married multiple times after Debbie's death. His fourth wife was there. People who knew him later in life saw a different man than the one described in the darkest parts of Debbie's past. But the jury did not weigh the case as a referendum on who Bob was decades later. They weighed what had happened to Debbie. They weighed the evidence, the inconsistencies, the patterns, the explanations that shifted over time. And they found Bob Atrops guilty of murdering Deborah Atrops. While the trial was approaching its end, another event unfolded that pulled attention back toward the alternative suspect people had never fully stopped wondering about. John Pearson was living in Arizona. 5 days before Bob's trial, officers arrived at Pearson's trailer, seeking to talk to him. Pearson saw them outside and killed himself. The timing was shocking. The act itself created a storm of questions, the kind that forms instantly in a case where doubt already lives. But there was no evidence tying Pearson to Debbie's murder. The DNA from Debbie's coat had excluded him. His earlier cooperation stood in contrast to an image of a man hiding from guilt. His death remained an unsettling piece of the timeline, but it did not alter the verdict. At sentencing, the emotional center of the case shifted to Rihanna. She had never been able to speak to Debbie, never been able to ask her about the fear, about the separation, about what was happening behind closed doors. Her entire relationship with her mother was made of fragments from other people. Her relationship with her father was made of lived time. Now she stood in court pleading for leniency, speaking not only as Debbie's daughter, but as Bob's daughter, and as the mother of children who knew him as their grandfather. Bob received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 25 years. If parole ever came, he would be in his 90s. For Debbie's family, the verdict closed a circle that had been open since 1988. Debbie had been found in the trunk, strangled, left like cargo. Her death had hung in the air for decades, with no one held accountable. For Rihanna, it was not closure. It was a second loss layered over the first. Debbie Atrops had been a young mother trying to separate herself from a marriage that frightened her, trying to build a safer life in Salem, trying to move forward while still sharing a child with the man she left behind. On November 29, 1988, she vanished in the narrow space between an evening appointment and a routine pickup. Less than 2 days later, she was found in the trunk of her car. And 37 years after that, the case finally ended the way it began, with the story of Debbie's last night narrowed down to one truth the court was willing to settle on. Bob Atrops killed Deborah Atrops. The life Debbie should have lived ended in silence inside a locked trunk. The life Rihanna built began without a mother and continued decades later with the crushing weight of a verdict that took her father too.